Okay, let's see if it works now.
First, to begin with, that firms set prices. Secondly, that they set prices in such a way to undercut their competitors, and therefore they have an incentive to lower their costs, because a lower cost enables you to set lower prices to be able to compete more effectively in the battle of competition. And that third implies that firms will have a strong incentive to continue lowering costs, and of course that means a downward pressure on wages, because that increases their profits and also lowers their costs. Increased pressure to extend the length of the working day, because that we're going to move down one level of concretion here, and we're going to start talking about the effects of profit rate equalization on relative prices. So now we begin the theory of relative prices, and the first thing to remind you of is that in the classical tradition, market prices reflect demand and first, to begin with, that firms set prices. Secondly, that they set prices in such a way to undercut their competitors, and therefore they have an incentive to lower their costs, because the lower costs to set lower prices to be able to compete more effectively in the battle of competition. And that third implies that firms will have a strong incentive to continue lowering costs, and of course that means a downward pressure on wages, because that increases their profits and also lowers their costs. Increased pressure to extend the length of the working day, because that lowers their costs and increases their profits, and increase the intensity of the working day, which also does all of those three. I mean, the paradigmatic example of that is Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, the famous sequence, which you can see on the YouTube at any point, which is when he joins a factory. He's an unemployed person who gets a job in a factory, and the whole beautiful imagery of him struggling against the intensification and pressure in the factory is quite striking. Charlie Chaplin, as you know, was driven out of the US because he's accused of being a communist sympathizer, and ended up in England and never came back to the US. His revenge is, of course, nobody remembers the mediocrities who drove him out, and everybody remembers Charlie Chaplin. Now, I also pointed out that one of the central things in Marx's theory of competition, especially, is the idea that lower costs are inversely correlated with higher capital intensities. And that's for the simple reason that by and large, not always, but by and large, the way you can lower costs, other things being equal, is to move to larger scale production. And larger scale means larger capital per unit, larger size of plant, larger amount of output, and so on. And this is, as I pointed out, is such a well-known phenomenon in empirical observation that many textbooks, business management textbooks, take this as sort of a kind of law of capitalism. And yet, interestingly enough, there's almost nothing about this in the standard economic textbooks. And that's because in economics textbooks you have this U-shaped cost curve at any moment of time, and then the cost curve moves over time in some way, and you have a long-run shaped cost curve which is the same, and that's all the assumptions of the shape are made in order to make it come out right, not to fit the empirical. However, for the same reason, I tried to argue that the fact that this notion of perfect competition, which was created as a specific opposition to what they felt was the classical notion of conflictive capitalism, a notion in which firms fought against each other, in which they fought against labor, and labor was forced to fight against other workers, that there was a class struggle, which is clear in the notion of class, in fact, even the idea of class, all of these things that began to be something that orthodoxy was increasingly uncomfortable with and began to formulate a different vision of capitalism, a vision that arises in the last part of the 19th century. And it's not because these people are particularly aware that they're going to become the leading vision, but rather their vision fits the ideology of the times, and it becomes therefore the leading vision. And that, of course, is neoclassical economics. So whereas classical economics focused on the actual structure of capitalism, class, conflict, warfare among capitals, conflict between workers of different sorts and different nations and so on, cost-cutting, price-setting behavior, and tried to build a theory of capitalism from that, the new vision was one of the idealization of capitalism, a kind of gilding of the image of capital. And there you get the idea that each firm is tiny and unable to influence anything. It's passive and helpless, that firms have to be therefore large in number to satisfy this requirement of being passive and helpless, so that they take the price as given, which means that now price setting has gone out of the picture. And with price setting gone out of the picture, then the firm has only the choice to do what it can to maximize its own profit. However, there's nothing in there that says it'll beat up on labor or try to reduce the strength of labor, because this is all a purely passive thing. Perfect markets are then defined this way, and you get the works of Jevons and Edgeworth and Menger, but then ultimately, at least in the West, the notion of Walras, at least in the modern post-1970s periods where Walrasian economics becomes central. And then I tried to lay out for you the structure of Walrasian economics, the rather bizarre representation of capitalism, in which every firm, every individual, every agent does no trading until the Walrasian auctioneer signals that all markets are in equilibrium, in which case there are no trades except in equilibrium, and by definition then all trades are equilibrium trades, which means that any time you choose to trade, it's because you know that you can sell anything that you offer, or you can buy anything that you want, and that includes labor power. It follows that in the Walrasian sense, all trades take place where people are perfectly satisfied, because they're not allowed to trade unless they're perfectly satisfied. And that gives rise to the notion that the market automatically leads to the satisfaction of all traders, as well as, of course, by implication, the full employment of all resources, including labor. The secret of this is the idea that the market automatically leads to that in the Walrasian sense. The difficulty with the Walrasian sense, of course, is that it's a pretty hard sell to say that the markets work with this godlike auctioneers making everything work out. And in fact, Walrasian economics led to a very interesting debate about whether Walras meant this to apply to capitalism or to socialism. Walras, as you know, or may know, was considered himself a socialist, though strongly hostile to Marx and the Marxian wing of anti-capitalism. He thought that socialism that could be achieved if the state would intervene to make markets behave in the way that he was proposing. So he saw this as a model for socialism, market-controlled socialism, and not surprisingly, it was picked up by some economists, especially those who are considered valuable in the Western tradition, and became a model of socialism. Abel Lerner and Oskar Lange were the two people who said, well, if you guys believe in Walras, then so do we. Walras is actually a model for Soviet planning, because where's the auctioneer? It's in the central planner. And that led to a kind of rapid aversion to the idea of a central planner, on the grounds that Walras was not really saying that there was an agency, an entity that was doing this, which would be the central plan, and that would then justify the Soviet model of socialism, but rather that markets all taken collectively, individually, perform this function. But then if you're going to say that the markets perform this function individually, you can't have the Walrasian auctioneer because he's the person, or it is the person, entity that's doing this. And that leads away from the idea of the Walrasian comes into play. The modern notion is that you have individual firms who are passive takers of price, and they maximize their profit on the basis of the assumption of certain curves. That workers are passive takers of the existing wage, and they maximize their balance between leisure and labor, and that consumers are passive takers of prices, and they maximize the balance between their cost constraint and their utility. So everybody's choosing some optimal balance of some sort, and that leads to everybody being perfectly satisfied from the outcomes of the market. And the purpose of perfect competition is precisely to give you a Walrasian conclusion without the Walrasian secret agent who's doing all the work. Is that point clear? Any questions about that? So I'm assuming you don't believe in perfect competition, right? So, yes?
But then how are prices set?
In perfect competition? Yeah. Well, that is one of the problems that many people have pointed out within this tradition, is that there's no mechanism for price setting, which is a kind of fatal flaw. I mean, at least in Walras, the auctioneer is making sure the price is set in such a way that every market is in equilibrium simultaneously. But as I said, if you go to the Walrasian version, then you might as well say that the Soviet Union is the closest approximation to that, which was anathema to all of the orthodox economists. So then came the idea of this price appearing out of the market. But Walras knew that the market had to have a price setter. Orthodox economics just skipped. Go to any standard textbook and see if you can find in there who sets the price. And the answer is there isn't a price setter. And this point was made by Hahn at Cambridge, who pointed out that, and by the way, a supreme neoclassical economist who says that within our theory there is no mechanism of price setting. And this is pretty much well known. It shows you how much a theory can tolerate as a gap if it has other functions, such as an ideological function, which will allow it to be accepted anyway.
Isn't this where they like traditionally appeal to scarcity and preferences and such? Like it's set in this sort of aggregate way where people are some sort of aggregation of people's preferences, people making offers.
Well, that's the Walrasian story. But for that version, you need the auctioneer to say, like, look, this is you're providing the demand for corn. These guys are providing the supply for corn. How are the supply and demand going to come together? The answer is the price has got to move in that way, right? So the implicit assumption is that somehow the market does it. But who is the market? It's not you because you're buying corn. It's not them because they don't set prices. And you don't set prices either. So there has to be a third set of agents who take supply and demand market by market. But where is that third set of agents? When you kill off the auctioneer, you kill off that set of agents also. And if you try to formally introduce them into general equilibrium theory, let's say you even ignore the agent, and you just say, look, when demand is not equal to supply, price will react some way. You cannot show that general equilibrium will arrive at the right price. So then they say, well, shall we move on to the next chapter and skip this part, because it doesn't work. Typically, when you look at the work of the great general equilibrium theorists like Arrow and others, De Breu, you'll see that they don't tell you any mechanism for how this prices. They ask the famous fixed point theorem, is there a non-null set? Yes, the answer is yes. And then you say, well, let's assume we're there. Now, many people have argued that this is absurd. There's no evidence whatsoever that actual markets work this way. And then they're told, well, you're not very good at theory. General equilibrium theory has already established this.
Is the computability argument
well, Vela is part of what people like Vela do, who are inside-outside. Vela always said to me that he was a person who was trying to work from the inside to show that it was not possible. And the trouble is, of course, that many people have done that. Part of your readings is, for instance, Kierman's reading of the fact that there is no possibility of a representative agent. The Emperor has no clothes is the subtitle of his article about the representative agent. So that can be shown formally. It's not possible to have aggregate production functions. That can be shown formally. It's been well known. Franklin Fisher at MIT. So we're not talking about people who are heterodox here. Vela, who's heterodox but partially not, has made this argument for a long time. In some sense, you could say Herbert Simon did this too. It has not had the impact of overturning the system. In my opinion, that's because if you look in the history of science, the debates among paradigms, you see that they do not collapse because the internal logic is got holes in it. They collapse because there's a better way of looking at it from the outside, which challenges them, and there's a political movement also. I mean, one can imagine, for instance, when Galileo was offered two choices. A, you renounce. B, see that pile of wood over there with the ropes around it? That's your next location. And that was a real choice. I mean, it's not a story. This is a real fact. He was offered those two choices. And supposedly, he accepted that he would renounce, but said under his breath. It's a famous thing, whether it's true or not, but it's in many plays. But still, it moves. And the point was that the earth was moving around the sun, right? Not the other way. And he whispers under his breath, still it moves. But he chose not to be barbecued. Well, his predecessor, Tycho Brahe, chose the other option and died at the stake. He was burnt alive. And people forget this way in which ideology is enforced. It's not just that you get punished and don't get tenure and jobs and all that. In earlier times, you had a more visceral reaction from the center. It's understandable why many people then choose to go along, and adapt and make their criticism on the side, but not enough to be led to the stake, so to speak. But other people in different historical periods make that other choice, and sometimes if history is moving in their direction, they become the center of a different argument. Darwin is another example of exactly that kind of break. And capitalism creates that space too, by the way. It creates the science and the attempt to constantly investigate nature, because that's essential to the development of capitalism's tools of all sorts, including medicines and everything of that sort. So that conflict was there, inherent. But Darwin happened to come at the time where he could be celebrated for that. In a different time, it would have been a different result. What's striking is that many of the people we look at don't really think of themselves as in that way. They think of the beauty of the truth that they found. And at least the ones who make it public, as opposed to those who keep it private, are the ones we celebrate now, no matter what happened to them. So from this point of view, if you assume perfect competition, and last time I talked about how perfect competition is internally inconsistent. Now I've been making this argument for 15 years, and I can honestly say it has zero impact. Not even the people who've taken my course remember it as soon as they walk out the door, but the fact is that it's easy to see that it's internally inconsistent, because if firms know everything, then the one thing they must know is that they're all alike. Then it follows that if they know they're all alike, it cannot be true that when they make a decision, they assume that no one else will make that decision, i.e. their expansion of supply will be too small to affect the market, because that would be logically inconsistent. It is true that their expansion will be too small, but they cannot ignore the fact that their expansion will be matched identically by the expansion of everybody else's supply, in which case the demand curve will be downward sloping, in which case each perfectly competitive firm will face 1/n of the market demand curve. Now, it follows from that if they all act as if they're facing 1/n of the market demand curve, then collectively they act as if they're a monopoly. Even though they're not competing with each other, they're not colluding, the result is identical, as if the whole set of firms knows that it has a downward sloping demand curve. Then in neoclassical theory's own argument, perfect competition leads to monopoly. Or to put it another way, the quantity theory of competition has no bearing whatsoever, because the quantity, when you have an infinite quantity and you have one as a monopolist, you get the same result. Okay? Now, I'm not arguing that you should use the neoclassical theory framework of monopoly. I don't believe in that. But the point is that this is an internal contradiction to the theory that comes from the logic of the theory. And again, that comes from the attempt to escape the need to have the Walrasian auctioneer, aka the Soviet planning board, as a story of how markets work. So there's an interesting theoretical and ideological and political dimension to this move. Any questions about this? It's a very good, interesting literature, by the way, thinking of paper topics, to go back and look at that debate between the Walrasian notion and Walras's own idea that he was a socialist, and then learn a longer notion that only market socialism could actually fulfill the vision of the market. Small firms, neutral auctioneer, and all that. And then the counter reaction by Hayek and von Mises, who said, no, only real markets that are not regulated by the auctioneer. But notice the inherent tension between the fiction on the theory and the possible terror that it might actually be brought in practice in a socialist country rather than a capitalist country. Any questions here?
I think this question about you all. What's the current outside activity that you hope will grow to generate the pressure?
Well, Paul Samuelson, who considered himself to be a sort of Keynesian economist, and was in fact more Keynesian until the McCarthy period came, and then he openly says, well, I quickly retreated to the center. McCarthy period was a period in which many academics who were on the left were destroyed, or at least marginalized, but in many cases destroyed, actually. Well, I'll save that for the list of these people, but anyway, so he said famously that change comes about. He saw himself as bringing a Keynesian revolution embedded in neoclassical theory. So, of course, his whole theoretical framework led to practical Keynesian policies in those days, at least, but embedded in a Walrasian or Marshallian framework initially. And he said famously that that kind of revolution comes one funeral at a time. And what he meant is that the old guard has to die off. However, the old guard has a tremendous incentive to replace itself with the new guard that's just the same. The new guard has to have sufficient distinguishing elements from the old guard to appear to be new. But they also have to be committed to the church, otherwise they won't be let in. And this is the history of every church. You know, each new generation says, look, I'm wearing a different color coat, but I still hope to be pope or bishop or whatever, and I still hold to the basic founding myths. Now, that kind of flexibility is inherent in every school of thought, including any church, and it does not imply that the church is fundamentally different because its clothing has changed. I think that's what's happening now. There's all the stuff about behavioral economics, which in itself is a fantastically interesting subject, but it's astonishing me that they are astonished to discover that people don't behave in the absurd way that theory says. And people are going around going, oh my God, they don't really optimize exactly, and I've discovered something that's going to blow up the whole thing. This is a way of preserving the church, and the ignorance is a deliberate ignorance. Gunnar Myrdal says that ignorance is as purposeful as knowledge, and that's a very important thing to understand. What people choose not to know is as important as what they choose to know. And they choose both, not in the sense of consciously sitting down and saying, I will choose to be ignorant, because there are social structures that shape their ignorance also. So if that's the case, the interesting question arises, why does anything ever change? If once you get a structure that's self-replicating, with each generation a little change in the clothing of the priests, why do they ever fall? The answer is because the underlying structures are not dictated by what you believe about them. That underlying real structure can come into conflict, contradiction with different elements of itself, and that can pose such a demand that some views of the world cannot be sustained, at least for that time. And that's another way of saying materialist theory of history. If history comes out of ideas, then there's no reason why ideas should ever change. If history comes out of the conflict or the relation between ideas and the reality, and if reality is something not merely a reflection of what you would like it to be, then things change. I'm ranting a bit, but I warned you earlier, I tend to rant if I get interested in the subject. I remember seeing a movie which I think is called The Robe, which is this horrible 1950s movie about the rise of Christianity. I'm not sure, I may have the wrong movie, but anyway, there's a scene. And the scene is that there's a magician, and this magician is very good at what he does. And he's so good that everybody comes to believe that he's got supernatural powers, including the king, and he rises up to the top. Top of the empire, really, and he wants to have bigger and bigger things to show his power. So in the end, in this scene in the movie, he builds this extremely tall tower, which he climbs up inside to the top of. And he says, I'm going to show you that my powers are so great that I can suspend the laws of the universe and I can fly. And he gets on there and he steps on there. Now, the way he set it up, like any magician will, of course, is that there is a hook on him and a slim wire, a steel rod, and when he jumps off there, the rod will hold him up and he'll flap and he'll go around. But he gets so carried away with believing that he can suspend the laws of gravity that he jumps off without putting the hook on. And this is where the material reality asserts itself, because he falls to the ground and is squashed into a puddle. Now that's the difference between thinking that you can evade the law of gravity and being able to actually suspend it, so to speak, without working against it. We can suspend it, we can push up against it, but we can't make it go away. And social reality is like that too. It exists in moments like the law of gravity, depending on the structure, and you can wish it away. You can be lucky to be isolated, but you can't make it go away for all. Now, this seems like a long digression, but at this moment, the magicians are falling from the tower because the crisis has made it clear that they can't actually fly. Ask, even the Queen says, what the hell were you guys thinking? She says, the Queen of England in 2007, how come you didn't see this coming? Where are my economists, she says, who were able to see this? That is where the law of gravity exerts itself. And the evasion from the reality gets exposed. However, every church can tell you this happens periodically, and they can close that gap. If they close it long enough, people forget. So it's not obvious that there will be a change. I don't think there's anything automatic about it. We know in the last Great Depression, the 2 depressions ago, 1930s, orthodox economics, the very economics which is dominant today, was pushed aside by Keynesian economics. We know that Keynes rushed to publish his book because he wanted to be there in time to have some effect. We know, unfortunately, he died quite young. He was involved in enormous activities like setting up Bretton Woods and pushing governments for policies and all of that, and he died quite young. Had he not died, Keynesian economics might have been very different. Who knows? What we do know in practice is that Keynesian economics was dominant and believed that it had control of the economy. Read anybody from the period of the 60s and 70s in policy, any textbook. They believed that it was just a matter of fine-tuning. Samuelson is on record saying, we've abolished crises, we've abolished depressions, we know how to regulate the economy and produce near full employment with stable prices. Even as they were saying that, prices were beginning to rise, and unemployment was beginning to rise, which was not theoretically possible. And that led to a new magician coming in, which was Milton Friedman and Ed Phelps. They said, wow, this is because there isn't any unemployment. Prices are rising because people are actually fully employed. Those people who say they're unemployed are merely shirking work. They have too many other options. They are voluntarily unemployed. So actually the unemployment rate is 0. But what are we doing? We're thinking it's high, and we're trying to bring it down. We're pumping up the economy, and we cause inflation. And that was the famous answer they gave, and that brought back neoclassical theory into power. Now, 2007, that very ideology that we've controlled everything, that the markets are perfect, is again open. Will it push neoclassical theory out of power? I hope so, but there's no guarantee. There's absolutely no guarantee. It can only come about if there are enough people on the ground pushing for this. And that means enough people organizing against the ideology of orthodox economics, not just saying that they want to get into Harvard by doing a little behavioral economics, but really saying this is the wrong place to start. You should have an alternative. Or even asking that it be presented as an alternative. Most universities, as you know, or if you are unsure, go sit in a class at MIT or Columbia or NYU. Any economics class, you will not hear anything outside of orthodox economics. You won't hear Keynesian economics. You won't hear post-Keynesian economics. You sure as hell won't hear what I'm trying to talk about here is classical economics. Yet, it can happen. It can happen because increasing numbers of people across the world are saying, enough. This doesn't work. Even the IMF is concerned about the difficulties that it's failed persistently to understand. It does not mean that they'll move away from it. In fact, they survived Keynesian economics in micro. So I don't know the answer. I do what I do because I think it's true. And that's the best you can do at some point. Okay, let me get off this rant and finish what I started to do, which is mention a further implication of the idea of perfect competition, which is once you accept the idea that perfect competition is the representation of capitalism more or less, and more importantly, it is the ideal form that capitalist society should take, then it follows that anything that doesn't fit it should be made to go back into it. And that's the famous Coase theorem and many other theorems like that. What does the Coase theorem say, essentially? It says that if there are perfect markets, then everything will be optimal. Now, that's a base, but actually people are not, in these perfect markets, people only care about what happens to them, and nobody cares about the effect of another person on them, or vice versa. So you don't care what happens when you do what you do, what happens to other people. That's not your job. and they don't care either. But they admit that in real life it's a little trickier. So the examples they give you are always typically small examples. Like, you know, in the earlier textbooks, you like to smoke cigarettes, and other people get worried about the consequence of that, so that's an externality, right? So that little externality means that there is a problem. Or if you're really bold in a textbook, firms emit pollution, and that pollution comes to your neighborhood, and you're unhappy about it. So what's the solution? The standard solution, the appropriate solution, is to make a market in pollution. So if you don't like the smoke coming from this side, then you say, well, I have to internalize that. I give you permission, but you have to pay me. And this internalizes the cost according to your preference, and then it's now back within a market, and the solution is by definition optimal. So if the West is pouring out billions of tons of pollutants, the solution is to go to the developing world and say to those wonderful, fair, representative leaders in the developing world, hardly a dictator among them, and say, why don't you tell us how much pollution your people would like? And they say, okay, we'll like a lot. Just set the market, no big deal. This is the ideology that dominates all of these notions. So the market will be perfect if we can internalize its externalities. Now, I've argued throughout that this is absolute and total nonsense, because it begins from the premise that people are mechanical, thing-consuming objects, and then brings in every aspect of humanity on the side. Why not start the other way? Why not say that people are these complicated interactions among other people, that we're social beings, social units, that we care a lot and will fight for others independently of whether we get something from it or not, which is absolutely well established in human history, and then talk about our feelings about commodities. And the answer is then you can't say that markets are perfect. You cannot give the ideology of capitalism. You can give the reality of capitalism, but you can't give the ideology of capitalism. So you will find that people will not accept that. I mentioned that this whole notion of treating externalities as something outside of human behavior is exactly what Marx calls commodity fetishism, which he predicts actually it will be an increasing feature of capitalist society, because in fact we are oriented towards commodities by advertising, by sellers, by social pressures, and that makes us feel as if our being and our satisfaction and our well-being come from things, not from people. And that's not because it's automatic or natural, because it's highly socially conditioned. Just as like a religion will say to you, your ultimate well-being can come from, not from you, not from what you do, not from other people, but from up there. And incidentally, we are the pathway there. You have to go through us first, because we are the ones who actually hear the voice from above, and so we tell you. In this case, capitalism hears that voice, that satisfaction, and it tells you, buy this, buy this, buy this. So that's not different. And I'm not alone in saying that. This has been said for hundreds of years. What's striking is that economics is the only profession which doesn't say this. So it has a unique function. It forms a particular role. Whether that function can be overturned or not, I don't know. Okay, so now this brings me naturally and immediately to the idea that if you consider real competition, then firms must consider demand, because they have to consider what other firms will do, and they consider their effect not in terms of their own output, but in terms of the collective response. And so every firm must take into account demand, and every firm knows, if they are price-setting firms, that their price setting is determined by two things: the degree to which the demand reacts to their price, that's one thing, and the degree to which other firms react to their price. Competitive, warlike competition among price setters. So once you talk about price setting, you bring in the idea of demand. And here you get a split in the theory. Post-Keynesians and Kaleckians look at the empirical evidence, firm set prices. And they say, well, see, this is imperfect competition. But in fact, if this is a necessary aspect of real competition, you cannot say that it's a proof of imperfect competition. It's only a proof of the invalidity, the lack of validity of perfect competition. And you must avoid the trap of thinking that if someone says A, you can negate it by saying not A. Not A is not a negation of A except in the purely formal sense, because it doesn't give you any place to stand except A. You can only say not A in reference to A. You have to say something else, which is, that's not the right place to start. There's another B from which I start, and I see both of these as trapped, and that's the point I've been making throughout. Perfect competition, imperfect competition are trapped in the same framework, and they cannot leave it. Now, what I want to show you, and what I tried to show you throughout these last lectures, is that you can actually explain what the empirical evidence is without relying on the notion of imperfect competition. You can explain it from real competition. It follows, and I'm going to show this today, I'm going to focus on that today, that if that's the case, then what imperfect competition correctly, the theory of imperfect competition correctly identifies as a phenomena. What it misidentifies is the explanation. It's not because it's an absence of competition, it's because of the presence of competition that you see the phenomena that you do. So my task today is to show you that what we see today empirically is exactly what you would expect to see, and therefore theories of imperfect competition are correct in the following sense, that they are explaining the real patterns, but they're wrong in the sense that they are needing to go into the theory of perfect competition in order to explain those patterns. So any questions about this so far? Let me begin first with Kalecki's view, because Kalecki is a person, I'm skipping over the rise of imperfect competition, Joan Robinson, Chamberlain, and all of that, which is relatively well-known literature because I need to get to the empirical aspects of it. So Kalecki initially posed his argument of effective demand, and this is a very important point for me. Kalecki's effective demand theory does not depend on his imperfect competition theory. Because as you know, if you read Kalecki's economic dynamics, you see that there's no reference there at the aggregate level to the theory of imperfect competition. That comes separately in the book. It's a separate issue. And this is relevant because Keynes also was asked, aren't you saying that really capitalism doesn't provide full employment because there's an absence of competition? And he goes, absolutely not. I'm not saying that. I think unemployment is a natural result of competition. It's known that he strongly opposed any attempt to repose his argument in terms of imperfect competition. So right away we have an issue. If the theory of effective demand does not depend on imperfect competition, and I'm going to argue that it's also inconsistent with perfect competition, then what is the micro-foundation of it? And my argument, which I will elaborate next semester in great detail, is that the natural foundation for it is a theory of real competition. Keynes, for instance, talks about how each firm has to take demand into account. And many people have pointed out saying you can't do that. If it's a perfectly competitive firm, by definition, it doesn't take demand into account. It takes the prices given. It doesn't care how much sales because it believes it can sell any amount. It's got an infinitely elastic demand curve, right? So it cannot take demand into account. So what is Keynes, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, and certainly someone who knows neoclassical economics from the time he was young, how could he say that firms take demand into account, knowing full well that firms can't take demand into account if they are within perfect competition? And so people say to him, you must mean imperfect competition. He goes, no. And I would argue because he is implicitly, and perhaps even explicitly, I'm not a Keynes scholar, moving away from the idea of perfect competition to some notion like real competition. Now, Keynes was a fantastically well-read, educated, witty, brilliant, and complicated person, but he's certainly not particularly knowledgeable about Smith, Ricardo, or Marx, or the classical tradition. He pretty much took for granted that Marshall was a representation of the classical tradition, and that's another connection that has to be broken because it's not true. It's a misrepresentation. But he took it and except for a few people like Dobb, whom he remained close to, and Sraffa, who had a better sense. But whether Keynes would have gone there, who knows? He didn't live to go there. So I'm going to make the argument that the theory of real competition is important not only for explaining empirical phenomena of actual capitalism, because it is also because it is the ground for a proper theory of effective demand. And the same thing that rules competition, which is profitability, will be shown to rule aggregate demand. And that point is not new. It comes from, again, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, who perfectly well understood that demand and supply both come out of profit. And I made this point before. If you are a firm and you choose to reproduce, not even expand, just reproduce, then you hire some raw materials, that's the demand for raw materials. You hire some workers, but the workers go and spend it on consumption goods, so you create the demand for workers' consumption. You get some investment goods. Well, that's a demand for investment goods. And lastly, you hand out dividends to your owners, your stock and direct owners, and their income goes into consumption and savings. So there's the other demand for financial assets and real assets, right? So demand comes from that foundation of profitability. And this point is evidently clear in practice. When businesses collapse, then demand collapses. It's not just that supply collapses, demand collapses too, because those two are linked to profitability. And when profits are not justifiable, when profits do not justify reproduction, they justify contraction, then demand contracts along with supply. It doesn't follow that demand and supply are automatically equal. If you think about this for a moment, you see that's obviously individual firms make their individual decisions and they create individual demands which add up. It doesn't follow that the demands add up to the plans that the firms are making. Because the firms are just one of tens of thousands, and every process that they make, they are in a sense imagining the demand for their good, and they're imagining the supply for their raw materials and workers and all that. And on the other side, the workers are imagining the demand for their product, their labor power. The sellers of raw materials are imagining. So it's actually a conflict of imaginations, of expectations. I don't like the word expectations, but I like to think of it as anticipations. Suppliers and demanders are anticipating outcomes. Now, here's where Walras steps in. Walras says, well, we'll have the auctioneer settle it all. But in real markets, there is no such thing. It cannot be. And instead, you get a collision of anticipations. And it's that collision that creates the turbulence of market adjustments. Some people will have produced too much. Therefore, in the next round, they'll shrink. Other people will have produced too little, so they will grow. Their price will rise. This price will fall. Same thing for labor power. And then the question is, does this automatically lead to an ideal outcome? And the answer is no. It leads to perpetual oscillations and turbulence around some kind of rough balance, a balance which may not be satisfactory and will periodically, this is Marx's point, periodically collapse and create what he calls that fearful devastation, which is inherent in the movement of market price around natural price. It's cycles, crises, ups and downs, turbulence. These are the natural outcomes of a system in which nobody tells you what to do directly. There is no central planner, but there has to be some consistency of plans, and that comes about through inconsistency. The order comes about through disorder, and they're not separable. And of course, every apologist for the system would like the order to be what you look at, and the disorder to be a kind of wrinkle on the side, an externality, a deviation, an accident of history, and all that. But that's just an apology. So, when I come to Kalecki, I therefore think of him as these two independent elements. Theory of effective demand, which we're going to get to later, along with Keynes. But now I want to get to the theory of competition in Kalecki. Yes?
I have a question. You said, as far as I understood, that in order for you to arrive to a theory of effective demand, you need to ground it in real competition, right? Does that mean that you cannot arrive to the theory of effective demand from a perfect competition framework, and that basically implies, or that basically is suggesting that the reason that they arrive at Say's law is basically from the fact that they are working in a perfect competition?
The second answer. I mean, think of what a perfect competition framework is. Suppose you go back to Walras. Right? In Walras, actually demand and supply are simultaneously resolved by the price. The price is that mechanism that makes demand and supply in each market equal. You are not allowed to step onto the stage of actual trading until that price is ideal. So then there's actually no Say's law in that sense. There is an immediate exact equality of supply and demand at all times. Moreover, that equality is full employment equality, because you as a worker would never go to work unless you're getting exactly the wage that you bargained for, given the demand for your product. So in that sense, it's a little bit of a false opposition to say demand and supply, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, as two opposite poles. In this case, they're simultaneously adjusted, and that's what general equilibrium tells us. But it tells us something more, which is Walrasian story. Every stock of assets is fully optimally utilized. In that sense, it's Say's law. In that sense, that the stock of assets, including the supply of goods coming to market in Walras, will produce a price that will fully realize it, providing that you understand the supply was adjusted to the anticipated price. Right? To get away from Walras, you have to have a different story, which is that labor will be fully utilized and all goods will be sold. And that leads to what we call supply-side economics, which I called earlier, which I will talk next semester, I'll talk about as pre-Keynesian orthodoxy. Pre-Keynesian orthodoxy was faced with this difficulty. How do you translate this micro story into a macro one? And how do you do it without the auctioneer? Then something has to be adjusted to make the supply, which is assumed to be full employment output, because that's bedrock of the theory. The labor market gives everybody a job at a wage they choose to accept. So therefore, you're fully employed. If you follow that, then firms employ workers at the ideal level of employment for workers, but then given a production function, they produce a certain output. There's no guarantee that that output will be matched by aggregate demand. But the difference between demand and supply at an aggregate level can be represented as a difference between investment and savings. Because consumption plus investment is demand. Consumption plus savings is supply. The consumption drops out, so investment minus savings is excess demand. So the story then becomes, can we tell a story of how excess demand goes to zero? And they say, and this is a point that Keynes attacks, demand for investment goods is a demand for loanable funds. Supply of investment goods is a savings is a supply of loanable funds. If savings and investment demand both respond to a single variable, interest rates. If interest rates rise, the demand for loanable funds comes down. If interest rates rise, the supply goes up. So if there's a gap, the interest rate will make it match. That becomes the theory of loanable funds that says full employment supply creates the demand it needs through the flexibility of the interest rate. And you can see why Keynes attacks those 2 points right there. That becomes central to this. He insists that you need another theory of interest rates, so it doesn't, and that leads him to the theory of supply and demand for money. And you need another theory of how production takes place, which he says comes from demand. So he tries to break that 2-part loop. And I'm going to talk about that in great length. But what I want to do is argue that Keynes's theory leads to a whole series of contradictions, the way he set it up, which become clear when you look into its long-run implications, let's say. And those contradictions lead to a different theory, resolving those contradictions. And then again, the way you do that is not to begin from theory of perfect competition. You need another foundation. So I'm going to do that at length. The book will be out in January, by the way, so at least in the second semester, you'll have all the graphs and charts. Okay? So let's see what Kalecki has to say. Kalecki says, let me start by saying that in my observation, and remember, Kalecki is an engineer, so he's looking at the real, and that's a very important thing. He's actually looking at reality. And he finds it doesn't fit perfect competition. Raw materials prices are demand determined because industry supply is relatively inelastic in the short run. Now, if you remember when we read Ricardo, or not in this course, when you read Ricardo, one of the things Ricardo says is there are 2 classes of goods: those whose price is determined by demand because their supply is not expandable. He talks about rare paintings and objects which cannot be produced. Then obviously the supply conditions cannot affect the price. They're demand determined. And that's no problem. Every classical economist recognizes that. But as he points out, these are a very small set of actual goods. Most goods are produced. And the question is what determines the price of that large set, ever-growing set of reproducible goods. And there in the Ricardian idea is the cost of production. Cost of production with a normal rate of profit so that the natural price becomes a regulator of market price. Now, Kalecki is coming from that point of view somewhat, but he says, and so he says, manufacturing prices are cost determined. Well, okay, that's from a classical point of view perfectly sensible. But how do they determine costs? Because, he says, they're imperfectly competitive, and firms typically carry excess capacity so that output can easily respond to demand. So now he's breaking away from the neoclassical idea and saying that firms have excess capacity. Now, I've already argued that within the theory of real competition, firms always have spare capacity, which is not the same thing as excess capacity. Excess capacity is when it's too much to hold. Spare is when you have it to adjust to the normal fluctuating. You look in your pocket and you have a few dollars in your pocket. That's the change you need to mediate your daily transactions, right? It doesn't follow that you have too much money. That's a different story. And if you have too much money, you'll take it out of your pocket and put it into something else. And that's the same thing for firms. If they have excess capacity, they'll either shut down a plant or they'll use it for some other purpose. They will not maintain it because that's a cost for which they get no benefit. So firms, we know, maintain a certain degree of reserve capacity. And they do that because the market is turbulent for these reasons of the competing and conflictual anticipations meeting each other in the market. And so they always have to adjust for that. Just like you have to carry money around, whether it's cash or a credit card, you have to have something, debit card, to mediate the fluctuations of daily life, right? So already Kalecki has fallen into the trap that the existence of spare capacity is the same thing as excess capacity. And that's what makes him an imperfect competition person. This is common among all theories of imperfect competition. They deliberately, consciously or unconsciously, so adhere to the idea of perfect competition that when they look at reality, they think it's absence of competition, when it is in fact a necessary feature of competition. I made the point that firms with large stocks of capital, large cost of entry or exit, will naturally hold larger amounts of spare capacity to mediate fluctuations, because since entry is difficult and exit difficult, fluctuations will not be met by an expansion of capacity. They'll be met by a fluctuation in the reserve capacity, And that's a well-known phenomenon in business, by the way. It's not because they're not competitive, it's because the cost of entry and exit is sufficient that you need a larger buffer, so to speak. Okay. So Kalecki then proposes the following theory of prices. Okay, Here's Kalecki's price. He says the price of the ith firm is related to its unit costs by some parameter m and to the prices of other firms. So he's built in some idea of a relation to cost and a relation to competition from your competitors. Now, I would argue that's perfectly consistent with the theory of real competition in the short run. The difference is the theory of real competition is going to affect the profit margin coming from this so as to make it consistent with a normal profit rate. So these parameters are not fixed. They'll be trial parameters. That's the point. You keep trying. Obviously, if firms are competing more effectively with you, then you will have to lower your price. If your costs go up, you may raise your price, provided the firms, your competitors, don't undermine you. So does everybody understand this equation? It's a pretty familiar one, right? Kalecki's equation of the price of the ith good, ith firm within a particular industry. So this is, you're all corn producers, but each one of you sets a different price in the market. So already, Kalecki is arguing that prices are not equalized. Secondly, the degree to which you can get away with this depends on how your competitors respond. Now, this is not different in principle from the idea of price-cutting behavior in real competition, where the new firms come in and they cut prices to make room for themselves in the market, to use Marx's phrase, make room for themselves in the market, and forces all the others to cut their prices. But they don't all cut their prices to match this one. They cut their prices in order to ward off this competition, and so you get a spectrum of prices, mostly related to cost, because high-cost firms cannot cut their prices as much because then they'll have negative profits. But it also depends on the intensity of competition. And so you'd expect a spectrum. Nonetheless, in the theory of real competition, you'd expect, whoops, what happened here? Uh-oh. Yeah. In the theory of real competition, you'd expect the average, if all firms are alike, or the regulating price, which is not in Kalecki's notion, to have a normal rate of profit. So Kalecki has this average here. He says, well, if every firm follows this rule, then obviously the average must follow the same rule, in which case we can say that the average price is equal to a markup, this funny-looking m, where it's a small m over 1 minus n. And he treats these small m and n as monopoly power parameters. And therefore, the price is related to average cost through a monopoly markup. That's this key point in Kalecki's argument. One could easily interpret this as a conditional markup, as a conditional relation. It doesn't have to be that prices are set in proportional to cost. You may be forced to set the price by your competitors. But there will be a markup anyway, because the difference between your price and cost is your markup. The markup could be negative for some firms, which is an important point. It doesn't have to be positive. And what competition does is if you have this price representing the regulating capital, then the M will be that which will give you a normal rate of profit. Not because you choose it, because competition enforces that upon you. So you could observe this pattern and have no difficulty explaining it. The key thing is the regulating capital have a markup which gives you a normal profit rate. That's a distinction between the Kalecki and the real competition version of the story. Okay? Now, with that in mind, I'm going to move to the handouts, which are, fortunately now, you have. And let's take a look and see how, I'm sorry, one more point. Almost all post-Keynesian theories are based on some version of this. Structuralist theory, Godley, Lavoie, Dutt, all of them are some version of the Kaleckian markup pricing theory. And as I said, that's not problematic in itself. The problem is treating this M as a decision and choice variable of the firm, because as Kalecki points out, it has the implication that if firms determine this markup according to their monopoly power, then by implication, workers have no say whatsoever in determining their wage. Because at an aggregate level, this markup can be easily translated into the wage share. It's just a profit share, really. It's a profit over cost, and by little manipulation, this becomes the determinant of the profit share. The profit share and the wage share add up to 1. So the firms determine the profit share that they would like through their monopoly power and other preference structures, and workers get only what's left over. And that implies, in Kalecki's theory, that it is not possible for workers to have any say whatsoever in determining their own standard living. Because given the productivity of labor, the wage share, given the wage share, and you have the productivity of labor given by technology, which certainly workers don't determine, then the real wage is purely a consequence of the monopoly power decision of firms and the technological choice decisions of firms. This is a very serious implication because it is completely contrary to the history of worker struggles. And Kalecki knew this and was troubled by the fact that his own theory implied that workers had no say. So at the very end of his life, he tries to come up with a version in which the monopoly power variables themselves depend on the strength of unions. So he says, well, if unions are strong, firms will be afraid to have too high a markup because it'll mean their prices will go up and wages will go up and real wages won't be able to change. But he's never able to resolve it. And I'm going to argue you don't need any of that, because with the theory of real competition, the price depends on the wage, on the real wage, and the real wage depends on the struggle between workers and capitalists, and workers and their employers, about conditions of work, which is the productivity of labor, and the payment for work, which is the real wage. And that's going to come back in the theory of effective demand. Now, the alternative to the post-Keynesian is that there is a set of people who might be called modern classical economists, for instance, Kurtz and Salvadori, Dumenial and Levy, Foley, myself, and some others, Steedman, Sraffa, who are in the sort of non-imperfect competition school in the classical tradition. And there are several basic positions. And on this issue, there are roughly similar positions, but not always. I'll come back to that later in the second semester. But the idea is that the wage rate can be, at least in principle, something determined by social balance of power. And therefore, the profit rate reflects the wage rate. Now, some people in that school don't believe that. They say the interest rate determines the profit rate, so workers' wages are purely a reflex of monetary policy. And there are lots of, I go into that detail in the book, but I'm going to have to skip it here. And the second issue which comes about, and I want to mention it here, is the idea that I have emphasized throughout that market prices are regulated by prices of production, or natural prices, right? But then the split comes in the literature about how this regulation takes place. I've tried to emphasize, and I tried to cite Ricardo, Marx, and Smith about the fact that this is a process of turbulent equalization. And it does not imply that market prices are close to prices of production. Because, and if that's true, you cannot use prices of production as a proxy for market prices. You cannot say that firms make decisions in terms of equilibrium prices, because there's no such thing as equilibrium prices. Equilibrium prices come about through turbulence, and that turbulence is the dominant one. So firms always make decisions in terms of market prices, not in terms of price of production. But that becomes a real problem for the choice of technique, for the idea of the so-called long period, which I think is false, is a meaningless construction. Because the long period can be viewed as a statement of the analysis of the properties of prices of production, and that's perfectly valid. It's a Smith and Ricardo and Marxist transformation. It's a confusion to think of that as a moment in which firms actually exist. That's a separate issue, in which they make decisions based on long period conditions. I don't know if this point is clear. I don't know how many people have experienced it. But imagine the following. I have a mass in physics, which is a donut, and the center of gravity is in the hole. Now, appropriately, if you want to analyze some properties of the movements of the mass, it's very important to be able to relocate the center of your analysis to the center of the donut, which is a hole. It doesn't actually exist in the donut. But it has some important properties. Center of rotation and so on can be located there sometimes. So that's an important property. But it would be a huge mistake to think that you can analyze it as if the donut material is in that hole. It isn't. That's a center of gravity convenient for some forms of analysis, but not others. So I don't believe that you can use that the classical economists were talking about the long period as a place. Where that comes from is Marshall. That's clear. And the Cambridge tradition is pretty much captured by the Marshallian tradition. And unfortunately, most of the so-called classical tradition is captured by the Cambridge tradition. So that's a big mistake. And we have looked again and again how equalization takes place. If you look at that real process, it would be astonishing to think that that real process implied that we were ever in equilibrium or close enough. Kurtz and Salvadori's book, which is a wonderful book, a very powerful bunch of material in it, are aware of this. And they say at the beginning, look, we're aware that market prices are not equal to natural prices. So we're assuming that market prices are very close, or close enough for us to continue analyzing actual behavior as if it is taking place at or close to equilibrium. I think that's wrong. I think actual behavior always has to be analyzed as in terms of market prices, and you have to show why the market prices are forced to conform, and therefore firms are also adapting. And that comes back to exactly this kind of issue. This markup here is an actual markup. It's not a competitive markup. It's not an ideal markup, but competition will force it turbulently to reflect an equal profit rate.
Just, I guess, a quick question about how firms set prices. Would firms in general want to set their price such that it is as close to the natural price as possible, or is it just completely they're looking horizontally at the other firms that they're competing with and they're setting prices according to what they're doing, and then it just it just happens to go around a naphtha price. It's not in any particular firm's conception.
I think the answer is firms will try to set their prices to get the highest amount of profit that they can sustain. And that's a tricky issue, but Harrod makes this point. He says, look, any firm could come in there and say, hey, I'm going to sell this product for $10,000. Oh, really? You're selling it for $5? Well, then I have a problem, right? How do I persuade customers to buy it for $10,000 rather than $5,000? So the answer is they know, of course, that they're working in a field where others would love to cut their throat, and this is like saying, go ahead, slash my throat. But there are circumstances in which they could try to get away with that for a time being, and then lower their price because the competition will come in. These are concrete conditions. It's like saying in a war, when you poke your head out of the foxhole, well, you don't poke them when someone's pointing a gun at it, but you're hoping that they're not pointing the gun when you poke your head out and see. So that is an issue which is concrete. And you can see from history of firms that do set high prices and get away with it, firms who do set high prices and don't get away with it. You can see firms who set low prices and don't get away with it because the prices are too low for them to continue to sustain. It's an evolutionary process, really. And the filtering mechanism is competition. It wipes out those who are too high and also sometimes those who are too low. We know that firms can come in and say, we'll set a low price, we hope to attract customers, so we'll make losses in the beginning. But the trouble is that if those losses go on too long, you're not there to benefit from them. Almost every business makes losses in the beginning because it doesn't have any customers yet. So losses are normal. The question is how long can you go before you decide that you can't take it anymore, you can't survive. So with this, I need to move, because I want to try to end close to 2, to the debate, empirical debate about monopoly and competition, because so far I've been using illustrations from the different theoretical approaches, and we need now to talk the actual empirical evidence. The main point I want to emphasize again is that you cannot take the deviation from perfect competition to be justification for the lack of competition. Because when the minute you do that, you're simply pledging your allegiance to the notion of perfect competition. And that pledge is, by the way, common in every school of thought. So I forgot this, so let me somehow I skipped this part. Where did it? Sorry, I don't think I did this last time, but let me just show you how astonishing it is that perfect competition is taken to be the notion of competition. And that's in the Monopoly Capital School. Here, sorry, I did this in the beginning, I forgot. As you know, the Monopoly Capital School is the dominant school in the Marxist tradition because it comes from Hilferding, was picked up by Lenin, and then becomes absolutely the dominant idea that capitalism reached a new stage in the 19th century of monopoly, and now everybody knows it's monopoly. And in the book, I trace the rise of this from Hilferding and Lenin and Baran and Sweezy, Koletsky and Steindl. And what I especially find helpful for me, for people like me, is an explicit statement of the foundations of Monopoly Capital School by the leadership of Monthly Review School now, which is Foster, McChesney, and Jonna, in a statement in Monthly Review in 2011. So this is pretty recent. They say that the neoclassical theory of competition, as expressed by Milton Friedman, is the paradigmatic notion of competition in economics. If you want to talk about competition, you go to neoclassical theory, and in fact to Friedman. Competition, from their point of view, is explicitly identified with the large number and small size of firms. A typical business has no significant control over price, output, investment. This notion of perfect and pure competition, which is common to all economics, is the principal meaning of competition in economics. Now, these are Marxists that are speaking here, not Chicago. So from their point of view, monopoly exists. Monopoly is anything that deviates from perfect competition. They say this explicitly, the Marxist school says. Monopoly, as they say, comes closer to the ordinary concept of competition. This is quite extraordinary that they put it that way, because if they had read Marx, which I find it hard to believe that they did, they would have noticed that all these phenomena are actually exactly what lie in the notion of real competition in Marx. So they say, anyway, we accept this notion of competition. Why? Because this notion of competition says that capitalism is perfect. And by showing that the real world doesn't conform to it, we have a means of critiquing capitalism and showing that it is full of defects. So if you deny, if you insist that there's monopoly, then you deny that the claim that capitalism is perfect, that it's optimal, and therefore you create a political foundation for the critique of capitalism. And so they pledge their allegiance, so to speak, to this idea. Now, other Marxists say, well, perfect competition was true, and this is a subset of the same argument in the Monthly Review School, in the olden days. No, Marx was talking about days when firms were all small, they didn't compete, they didn't collude, they behaved in the service of people. But nowadays, firms are different. Again, this is an extraordinary statement because it is so absolutely ignorant of what people like Marx were saying. In fact, it's not me saying that. Here's Schumpeter. Schumpeter says that the claim that perfect competition used to exist as a representation of capitalism is, I quote, involves the creation of an entirely imaginary golden age of perfect competition that at some time, somehow, metamorphosed itself into the monopolist stage. But, he says, it is quite clear that perfect competition has at no time been any more of a reality than it is at present. So Schumpeter, a historian of economic thought, is saying that it's a fiction. This is another point which is important to me, is that it's often true that for political reasons people will make a particular attachment because it's convenient politically. I think that is as close to a crime in science as I can imagine, because that says that your explanation of reality is dictated by what you'd like to see. And that's not a science. That may be politics, but it's certainly not. It's Ted Cruz economics. And the fact that it's done on the left doesn't make it any more acceptable. Okay, so now we come to what I wanted to do, which is to talk about actual empirical evidence. Well, the first step in talking about actual empirical evidence is this chart, which you have in front of you. I go through the different schools of thought and try to see how they represent the issue of the following topics. For instance, the number of firms. In perfect competition, these must be very large. Imperfect competition, by definition, they can't be very large because it wouldn't be perfect. It wouldn't be imperfect. And in real competition, it's not relevant. The competition among firms can be very intense if you have 5 firms all trying to kill each other. Yeah.
This is actually very interesting because I relate it to the Bertrand paradox. You can actually find that prices are going to be equal to the minimum cost level to the perfect competition scenario, even with only 2 firms.
Yes, but remember that it's still a way of getting to perfect competition.
Yeah.
And in real competition, you're not going to get this Bertrand result. So
my question is, because usually they use the number of firms as a measure of the degree of competition in a specific market.
Right.
What would be a measure for the degree of competition in a scenario or in the framework of real competition?
Very good question. The basic idea is that in the absence of collusion, explicit collusion, firms have an incentive to kill each other. And the fact that you have 5 firms in the ring doesn't mean that there's going to be less fighting in the ring. So you have to show that there is some explicit agreement to go over the incentive that any one of them has. And another point made by Jim Clifton in the first issue of the CJE, when he says, look, it was his belief that the development of the large corporation was a way of perfecting competition, not the absence of competition. And he makes a point in the following way. He says, look, if you have a big firm is not the corporation. A big firm is just the particular location of some part of the corporate assets. Corporations are typically not only tied up in one firm, but many firms in different industries, and maybe even many firms in the same industry. When they look over their balance sheet, they look to see where the highest profits are. They have no mercy and no attachment to a particular thing. They're not Kentucky Fried Chicken coming from the South. They're Kentucky Fried Chicken who bought the Colonel's name, transformed him into an actor, and sold it all over the world, and they couldn't give a damn if nobody in Kentucky can eat fried chicken because they can't afford it. That's not their problem. And so he says the rise of the large corporations is a means of extending and intensifying competition. It's not the absence of it. And here the scale becomes exactly a weapon in competition. Okay, scale of firms, which is the same point. Very small in perfect competition, not very large and not very small. It's always a negation of perfect competition as far as imperfect competition is concerned. And you come to real competition, again, not relevant for the Clifton argument and many others. Costs, all identical in perfect competition, different in, again, it's a negation of perfect competition in the theory of imperfect competition, and different in real competition. And that's because new firms are always entering with lower costs, and old firms with higher costs exist for some time, so you always get a spectrum. Demand curve. Horizontal in perfect competition, firms don't care about demand because they believe they can sell as much, which, as I've said, is irrational. Downward sloping in imperfect competition, downward sloping in real competition. Prices. Identical in perfect competition, different based on costs via markup. In imperfect competition, different based on costs due to price-cutting behavior, which is the point I tried to make when I showed you the Harvard Business Review story of how you cut prices, but not as much as the new entrant. Pricing behavior, price-taking in perfect competition, price-setting in imperfect competition, and price-setting in real competition. Price flexibility, very great in perfect competition because price is a scarcity. Price is supposed to move in. Price-setting behavior, not very great in imperfect competition, and in real competition is periodic because price setting, changing set prices have costs to it, so-called menu costs, but that's a fairly well-known phenomenon. Cost cutting. None in perfect competition because firms don't care about anyone else. They only care about their own profit maximizing point. Cost cutting not discussed at all in imperfect competition because firms don't compete with each other directly. They just set the price in light of their potential competition, and absolutely intrinsic in real competition. So there's one fundamental difference is right here in this part here. Profit margins on firms identical in perfect competition because all firms are exactly alike, so of course they have the same profit margin. They're different in imperfect competition due to monopoly power, that's Kalecki's price equation, but they're different in real competition based on costs and price cutting. And I showed you in illustration how firms with different costs meet the new entrant whose cost is lower by cutting their price, but not as much, so you have a correlation between prices and costs, which come from competition itself. Profit rates, identical in perfect competition, different in imperfect competition, different in real competition within an industry. And the reason for that is, within an industry, competition puts pressure on the price, but not on the profit rate, which is the consequence of the price pressure. So you expect them to be generally different. Price leadership, none in perfect competition, biggest firms in imperfect competition, and the regulating capital in real competition, not necessarily the biggest firms, it could be. Depends on the firms at the lowest cost. Correlation between profit margin, scale, and intensity, none in perfect competition because everybody has the same profit margin, everybody has the same scale and the same capital intensity, so there's zero correlation, obviously. Positive in imperfect competition theory due to monopoly power, and positive in competition theory due to competition. Why is that? Because larger firms will have lower cost, they'll have lower prices, and therefore, they'll have lower costs, so at the same or nearly the same prices, they'll have higher profit margin. How do they get their lower costs? By higher scale and higher capital intensity. So you would expect to see a positive correlation between profit margins, scale, and capital intensity, purely from the idea of pressure on price equalization. The classical law of one price story. Now, between industries, profit rates of price leaders are identical because everybody's alike in each industry, so they have identical profit rates. So this industry has alike firms, equal profit rates, so that there's no difference. You could take a firm from one industry and move it to another industry, label, and you still get the same profit rate because they all have equal profit rates. According to imperfect competition, they differ according to monopoly factors, and according to real competition, they differ according to the stage in the turbulent equalization of the cycle. So you won't be able to tell from the difference. You have to see if they go up and down, back and forth. And that's very important. I tried to show you data on incremental rates of return a couple of lectures ago. Profit margins of price leaders, different according to capital intensity. In imperfect competition, one important point is that in imperfect competition, the cost curve in orthodox economics includes a normal profit rate. That means that it includes a normal profit margin. So if imperfect competition theory is to be correct, it can only really speak of the excess profit margin, the profit margin above a cost which includes a normal profit curve. And in fact, Kalecki in his earlier work and many imperfect competition people are working exactly with neoclassical theory. And so they're assuming the cost curve includes a normal profit. But when they come to the empirical work, they don't separate out normal and excess profit. And so then they look at the correlation, and they look at a correlation such as profit margins here, which they expect to be due to monopoly power, but they haven't distinguished between normal profit margins and excess profit margin. A few people, like Kriegel and some others, Chrysler, mentioned this is a very serious problem with Kaleckian theory or imperfect competition theory, that they don't distinguish between normal margins, which are part of competition, and excess margins, which presumably would be related to absence of competition or deviations from it. Profit margins of price leaders, different according to capital intensity across industries, because different industries will have different capital labor ratios, so they'll have different profit margins, but they'll have the same rate of profit. Excess portion of that profit margin will differ according to monopoly factors within imperfect competition theory, and again, different according to capital intensity within real competition theory, because in real competition theory, the price leaders will have roughly the same profit rates. So of course, those who have higher capital intensity must have higher profit margins also. And I made that point earlier. Profit rates of industry identical in perfect competition, different according to monopoly factors in imperfect competition, and different according to the mix of non-regulating and regulating capitals in the theory of perfect competition. And lastly, reserve capacity, none in perfect competition, higher in monopolized industries according to imperfect competition, higher in industries with higher scale of entry. I made that point earlier in the lecture, so that should be okay. Now, so let me now go to, I'm skipping now because I'm running out of time, so let me go to, I was going to talk a little bit about price rigidity. The idea that prices are rigid is proof of absence of competition is only if you believe neoclassical theory of competition. If firms are price setters, then you will see prices are rigid until they adjust them. The fact that they adjust them periodically will be seen to you as if it's absence of competition, but this is just another natural feature of real competition. So here is a graph, which is a picture of what Alfred Eichner calculates the prices of two sets of industries. One he calls competitive because they have essentially a low degree of concentration, and concentration is measured typically in these. Let me back up. I'm sorry, I started this wrong. Start again. In neoclassical theory, every firm is identical. Therefore, every firm will have a tiny share of the market. If there are 100 million firms or 100,000 firms, then each firm's share would be 100,000. So they'll have small individual shares. So if we take the top 10, you'll get only 10 of 100,000. That ratio of the top 10 or the top 8 or the top 3 is called the concentration ratio. And the ratio has meaning precisely in a theory that says that every firm is a tiny part of the market, so the top 10 or the top 3 will be a tiny part of the market also. Conversely, if you find that the top 3 or top 8 or top 10 have a significant share of the market, that is prima facie evidence of the absence of perfect competition, and immediately people say this is the absence of competition. Now, I've already argued against that second inclusion, but Eichner is coming from the post-Keynesian tradition, and he divides firms into those which have low concentration ratios, which he calls competitive, and those which he considers high concentration ratios, which he calls oligopolist. And you look at the competitive one, you see that their price is like that, and you look at the oligopolist one, you see their price is much smoother, and he says this is proof of absence of competition. But notice something about this. Oligopolist ones are typically accused of being the ones who set their prices to be higher than competitive ones. That's the whole point, right? If they do that, one would expect them to somehow be rising faster, unless this is a static difference that they maintain throughout for some unexplained reason. But notice that there is no difference in the trends of the two types of curves. In fact, the so-called oligopolist industries are just smoother in their price, and one would explain that straightforward from the fact that higher concentration is typically associated with higher capital intensity. And higher capital intensity has higher reserve capacity, and we would expect from the theory of real competition for this to be associated with smoother price adjustment and more rapid quantity adjustment. You do have to adjust somehow. If you don't adjust your price, you have to adjust your sales quantity somehow. So this argument is what I would consider to be exactly predictable from the point of view of real competition. Now, Zemler in 1984, in that classic study of competition which he did, looks at the price flexibility in relation to costs and concentration increasing over 18 time periods, and finds basically that there's not much relationship between price flexibility and concentration. All the coefficients of concentration ratio are small. Most are negative, which contradicts the monopoly power thesis. There are better results if you use high concentration ratios, but again, that's exactly a proxy for scale, capital intensity, and that's predictable. So this is Zemler's study. You can see that if you have 4 firm concentration ratios, and here you have percentage of price decreases or increases over different periods, then if you plot his data, you see that inequality goes up with concentration, price increases, go up with concentration ratios, which seems to support the idea that concentrated firms increase their prices. But in the second period, they go down, and in the third period, there's really no change. And this is a typical result. If you pick your period right, you get the result you like. If you pick more periods, the result disappears because it's more local. This is a famous study by Bain. And what Bain wanted to look at, and this is a study that started the whole imperfect competition empirical literature, really, it's the big one, writing in 1951. He looks at the rate of profit on equity, which is not quite right because he should be looking at on assets, but he had data on equity, versus the concentration ratio of the top 8 firms. So in the bottom here, we have the percentage of the market which is controlled by the top 8 firms. On the top, we have the profit rate on equity, and you get this picture. Now, Bain says, look, if I fit a regression to this, I'm not going to get a very strong result. You pretty much see, you want the result to be upward sloping, right? And you're not going to get it. And he says, yes, actually, I get a very bad result, and so, and if he'd left it at that, it would be fine. But he wants to show that they have higher profit rates in higher concentration. So he looks at that data, and there's no positive correlation. So what he does then is group them. And by grouping them, he gets a picture that looks like this. Now, I drew these circles to bring them to your attention, but you get a picture that looks like this. No, that's not really much of a better picture because you run a regression through it, the R-square is vanishingly small and not significant statistics and all that. So he goes, okay, well, anyway, what you can see is that if firms have high enough concentration ratios, that's here, then they have higher profit rates. And so what he does is he compares firms up in this top part to firms in the lower part. And he says this top part has a significant higher profit rate than the lower part. Now, I drew these circles in to draw your attention to the fact that he could equally well have made the same argument by taking the firms in the low part and then the rest. And that would have led to the conclusion that low concentration gives you a higher profit rate. Or better yet, he could have drawn a U-shaped curve, which I actually fit in the book, and show that low concentration gives you high profit rate, middle concentration gives you low profit rate, and high concentration gives you high profit rate. But that pretty much destroys the whole notion that concentration is a source of monopoly power, right? Because the bigger you get going from here to here, more concentration, you'll lose monopoly power. Then suddenly it pops back up. And Baines is probably the classic study. Now, as a result, not surprisingly, the argument was then made that, look, these firms have higher profit rates not because of the concentration ratio, because then the low ones would also have higher profit rates, but because there's something else here that makes them, and that was called barriers of entry. Now, what is a barrier of entry? It's capital intensity, scale. Why is that a barrier of entry? Because in theory of perfect competition, all firms are tiny. Therefore, any firm that's not tiny is a deviant, and that deviation implies a barrier to entry. I always wondered, barrier to whom? I don't set up supertanker fleet, so definitely a supertanker fleet with its minimal cost of $100 million is going to be a barrier of entry for me. It's not a barrier to entry for capital. That kind of expenditure is perfectly normal. Whoever does it picks up the phone, calls the banks and say, I am going to do it, and they say, what are your assets? Okay, it seems good. $100 million in your bank account the next day. There's no barrier of entry in that sense. There's a cost of entry, and the bigger the scale, the higher the cost of exiting it if you get wrong. But that's not a barrier, that's just a condition of entry. And that's why if you have a big entry cost, you're going to have more reason to stick around and absorb fluctuations through capacity utilization and not through price, because other people are not going to rush in just because price has gone up. And you're not going to rush out because price has gone down. You've got a lot of commitment there. So that is a perfectly understandable outcome. So, but from the theory of perfect competition, you need something else. So then you come to this kind of story from Mann, which takes the Bain data and expands it, and finds that you have, if you take barriers on the vertical axis and concentration on this axis, then you see that if you have very high barriers and concentration, then you have a higher profit rate than if you have moderate barriers and low concentration. So this comes a way to rescue Bain's argument by saying, well, those firms in the top are ones that also have high barriers to entry. As I said, the notion of barriers is intrinsic to the idea of neoclassical idea of entry. But then if you ignore concentration and you look at all industries, not just concentrated industries, you see the same result appears. High barriers, higher the barrier, the higher the profit rate in this data set. So then it's not concentration, except insofar as concentration is correlated with barriers, because you can see in all industries with higher so-called barriers, you get higher profit rates. So perhaps that's a justification. Barriers of entry, but not of concentration. But then Stigler comes along, Chicago School, conservative economist, and says, well, look at my data. I've taken the earlier data of Bain and I've expanded it to over different time periods, and I've got profit rate on assets, which is the correct measure. And you can see that if I look at concentrated industries, their profit rate on assets goes up and comes down. But if I look at unconcentrated industries, their profit rate on asset goes up more and comes down more. But notice that there's no difference in their average profit rate. The whole idea that somehow concentration gives you a higher profit rate, generally speaking, is just not true. What it does seem to indicate, which is consistent with Eichner's evidence and all that, is that concentration is a symbol for scale of entry. And that gives you smoother fluctuations in price and more in capacity utilization. So the smoother profit rate is perfectly consistent with that hypothesis, which is a necessary implication of real competition. Rosen takes the Stigler, Bain, and Mann theories and groups them according to the average rate of profit in concentration. If concentration is high in this period and this period, average in this period, and so on, high to average ratio, you notice that over different periods, the concentration ratios change, and the profit rates are converging to a kind of mean. That becomes clear if you look at, say, Dempsey's data, where you have rates of return on concentration. If you look in the period 1963 across concentration ratios, CR4 in this case, and rates of return, as concentration ratios get big at this point, rate of profit goes down at the high concentration ratios. It sounds just like Bain. You take another time period, 6 years later, and it's the other way. At high concentration, the profit rate is the same or even lower. And that tells you it's a cyclical process, again consistent with less flexibility in price among firms. I'm rushing a bit, but I need to get to the end of this. Okay, so 2 more points here. A lot of these studies are in terms of profit margins and profit rates. But profit margins, as I pointed out, would normally be concentrated, even correlated, even in the case of real competition, with capital intensity. And the reason is simple. It's because the profit rate is equal to profit over capital. I divide the top profit by output, so I get profit margin, profit per unit output or sales. And the bottom, capital by output, so I get capital intensity. So the profit rate is equal to profit margin over capital intensity. Well, if profit rates are all equal, then firms or industries with higher capital intensity must have a higher profit margin, because there's no way otherwise the profit rate will not change, right? So necessary correlation across industries is high profit margin, high capital intensity. And that's from competition alone. So if you want to say that this is imperfect competition, you would have to show that the profit margins are excess profit margins are correlated. And as I said, the literature doesn't bother to do that, because it is so attached to the neoclassical idea that the profit margin is built into cost that it takes the actual profit margin in businesses as an excess over normal. But it isn't. In real businesses, costs don't include any profit at all. And therefore, the profit margin you're looking at is what it is, the actual profit margin. And the fact that it's correlated with capital intensity across firms, across industries, is exactly what you'd expect. And the fact that when we look at concentration ratios, you do not see any relationship between rates of return and concentration that's stable or in any one direction, is again perfectly the idea that you get a turbulent equalization. Some years it will, and some years it will be the opposite. The high shall be brought low, the biblical injunction of competition. So this brings me to a somewhat truncated end of what is chapter 7 in the book, which has got a lot more detail, which I unfortunately had to skip over here. But the basic point is clear. The theory of real competition is perfectly capable of encompassing the actual phenomena. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exclude the possibility of monopoly. But to identify monopoly, you'd have to show specifically that profit margins are higher than they would be otherwise expected. In other words, that profit rates would be higher. That's the key point. You'd have to show that profit rates are higher. Now, firms may collude. If they collude, it's possible that they can raise their prices. But again, when you look at collusion, you don't find much evidence that they are able to also raise their profit rate. And that, after all, is a measure of the success of the whole process. If you can't raise your profit rate, then collusion may have other valid benefits to you. And it's not clear what those are, but at least it's stable prices. But you don't actually get more profit. So it becomes a form of getting profit rather than a form of getting more profit than others.